Welcome to Global Perspectives. More than a half decade into the Arab awakening, what is the situation? For insights, we turn to Ambassador Gary Grappo, a veteran diplomat with assignments all over the Middle East.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Ambassador Grappo.
Thank you very much, John. It's wonderful to be back.
So, Arab Spring, Arab awakening, how do you sort of capture what is happening now in the Arab world?
I actually like the term Arab awakening because I think for the people of the Middle East, that's what it was. Now, of course, there's much that leaves to be desired about how this has progressed in many of the countries where this uprising took place. But awakening is a good way because it did awaken the people of the region to their own aspirations and hopes and educated the governments and their leaders about what they wanted.
And from the beginning, it seemed like this was going to result in profound, potentially positive changes for the region. And we got some positive changes, but a lot of them haven't been. So did you anticipate the negative developments, or did you think that we would move beyond them and hopefully be in a more stable situation right now?
Well, I think everyone had the highest hopes for this event and what would then follow. Certainly the people of the region did. Sadly, it hasn't quite turned out that way in many of the countries in which these uprisings took place. The one outstanding case where things seem to be progressing forward has been Tunisia, even though they are still clinging to this functioning democracy that they have. They know that it's very precarious. Nevertheless, they continue. But in other countries like Egypt, like Yemen, like Libya and Syria, of course, we have seen considerable tragedy. We've seen backtracking in Egypt, for example, where you have even a stronger right-wing government. And then, of course, the tragic civil war that has erupted in Syria. So, no, I did not expect it to go as badly as it has, but in hindsight, I understand why they're probably in this current situation, but why we can still also take hope from what took place this almost 6 years now.
Now, you mentioned Syria. Iraq is another situation where there's still a lot of question marks. Do you anticipate that those issues will be resolved in both countries in 5 years or 10 years, or are we going to be having the same conversation every time we meet?
I remind people that the Lebanese civil war that went for 15 years, from 1975 to 1990, and was only brought to an end when the countries basically settled on the status quo ante with some modifications. And that cost the lives of 180,000 Lebanese. We're now into the 5th+ year of the civil war in Syria. It's cost 500,000 lives. Half the country is either a refugee or internally displaced, and probably more if we were able to account for all of them. So the proportions of this are far in excess of what we encountered in Lebanon, which I said went for 15 years. So this could go on for a while, particularly when you have such intransigent sides. The Syrian government totally unwilling to talk to significant opposition. We have extremist components like the al-Nusra Front, like the Islamic State, and then scattered literally hundreds of other opposition groups fighting against one another, fighting against Assad, and fighting against some of the more extremists like the Islamic State. And then we have the Russians and the Iranians providing very strong backing to the Syrian government. So I don't see an immediate solution.
What do you say to the critics who respond to the situation in Egypt, for example, with their own interpretation of things? Yes, democracy was derailed to a certain extent, but there's more stability now. How do you respond to that type of assessment?
Well,
I mean, is there more stability now, first of all?
Well, looking at the Middle East writ large, you'd have to say stability is not a bad thing. There's a lot of instability, which is costing the lives of way too many people. However, we have to take a look at what Egypt now has today. And while the Egyptian people may be somewhat more comfortable with what they have now than what they had under Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, the same concerns, the same worries that they had that led up to the Tahrir Square demonstrations in 2011 are still there, and at least from what we can judge from this current government, are not going to be adequately addressed. And so the country is going to have to eventually come around to recognizing that the ultimate hopes and desires of the people of Egypt are not being addressed. And how is that going to happen? We would argue, from the perspective of the United States, it can happen with more democratic forms of government. Not overnight, and perhaps the Egyptians rushed too quickly, but with progressive reforms ultimately culminating in a democracy, I think they can realize the dreams that they had that were first expressed in 2011 in Cairo.
Do you think that these challenges need to be worked out by the people of each of these individual countries, or is there a role for big powers, superpowers like there was in the past, especially when they cooperated and came up with a common agenda that led to peace agreements in the early 1990s?
Well, I think the large countries, the more powerful ones, especially the United States, most definitely can play a role, particularly as an outside facilitator and encourager-in-chief, so to speak. But in the case of Syria, or even in Yemen, the United States and other countries have tried to do this. But unless the sides are ultimately willing not only to just sit down at a table, but negotiate an end to the conflict, then no outsider, unless that outsider is willing to introduce large amounts of troops, which I don't think certainly our country is prepared to do, is going to be able to affect the kind of change that we want to see or in the conflict. So it takes the sides, just as it did in Lebanon. It took the three sides to finally come around and understand that they were not going to be able to solve this conflict through warfare. And that brought them to the negotiating table. And I hope it brings the contending parties in these conflicts to the negotiating table soon, because people are paying a steep price, obviously.
If we go back to the Madrid conference of 1991, you had Washington and Moscow not 100% in agreement, but substantially in agreement about the need to bring some kind of lasting solution to these crises. Now we seem to be at opposite ends of the conversation on a lot of areas, including Syria. Is there a possible rapprochement between the United States and Russia on these issues, or do you think that they'll continue to be far apart?
I certainly would not want to dismiss the possibility or even the opportunity for the two countries to work together to resolve some of these crises, especially in this region. The difficulty we face, of course, in Syria is that Russia is a very strong supporter of the current regime, and the United States has gone on record as not only opposing it, but wanting to see it go. And the United States still insists that the leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, must go in any ultimate solution, although there has been some waffling of late in our language on how that might happen. But the two sides are going to have to agree that whatever outcome might be achieved by everyone coming to the table to negotiate, that they can live with that. And I'm not sure that is the case right now, particularly in the case of Russia and Iran, which also supports Bashar al-Assad and this regime, that they are willing to accept that. I think there is some concern that what might ultimately result in any negotiation could actually run contrary to their specific interests, most especially Iran's.
Do you think the Russians would support the ouster of Assad under certain conditions? Because they've made some noises about being willing to accept his departure as part of an overall solution, but there don't seem to have been substantive steps in that direction.
If we can believe what President Putin has said about Syria and his concerns about that country in terms of stability then yes, there might be a solution that could be achieved in which perhaps over a brief period of time, Assad could remain but would then depart, and a new government would take over, even if it's an interim government, until there could be elections and so forth. I think that is possible. But again, even if we were to agree, we and the Russians, I don't think that's even in the realm of possibility unless the contending parties can accept that. And we mustn't forget that two parties are not at the table, and under no circumstances will they ever be at the table. And we and the Russians agree on that. And that's the al-Nusra Front, which is a satellite organization of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. They are never going to be at the table. So if the contending parties could accept something like that, I believe that Russia and certainly the United States would accept that as well. Of course, we'd have to understand what then follows.
We had a recent presidential election in the United States, and now there's a lot of thinking being devoted to U.S. relations with the Middle East and other parts of the world. If you were part of those conversations, what recommendations would you offer? What should be the sort of ABC top priorities that the United States should address right off the bat?
Well, I think the first question that has to be answered, and this is kind of zooming out a bit, is what role does the United States want to play in the Middle East? Until now, the United States has been the premier outside power in that region. And many, if not most of the countries in that region have looked to us, have deferred to us on all sorts of issues. We have very important allies and friends in that part of the world. And I'd say most of the countries fall into that category, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Egypt, Morocco, Jordan. You can go down the list. So I think the new administration is going to have to define what role the United States will play in the Middle East. Are we going to remain the primary power in that region, which means we have considerable sway in what happens, but we don't have the final decision? Or are we going to sort of continue what President Obama has begun, and that is to kind of step back in some areas? I think that's the first question this administration is going to have to answer, and that will be pivotal in deciding how we address all these other crises, whether it's Syria, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Yemen, Libya, and so forth.
At various times in the past, we've had Middle East leaders from different countries who have either taken the lead or tried to take the lead in sort of setting a direction for the region. Some of them succeeded for a while and others didn't. But right now it doesn't appear that there's anyone who's in that kind of position. Is there anybody who comes to mind in any country who would be seen by many or a majority of the other countries as a natural leader, as someone to carry the banner into the future?
For the entire region?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so, and I don't think even if someone were capable of playing that role, that the person would actually want to assume that role, for the simple reason that all of these countries are facing not only the problems of the region writ large in various ways, but also there are very specific challenges. And even the oil-producing countries now are having to contend with some economic difficulties that they have never had to face before, with the price of oil being what it is and unlikely to change significantly in the near-term future. So I don't see that happening. Typically, however, when it comes to the Arab countries, the two powerhouses have been Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Egypt now is so fraught with its own challenges that it cannot play the role that it once played. Saudi Arabia can. However, there's a, so to speak, a new kid on the block, and that's Iran. And Iran has made it known that it wants to be a player in the region, and I don't think we could ignore the fact that it is a major power in the region today. And to some extent, whether intended or not, it has been further empowered by the nuclear accord that they were able to reach with the United States and the other P5+1 countries last year. And that's kind of where the big struggle, the big confrontation is going to take place. I don't think it'll become a military challenge. Neither country can afford that, any kind of military engagement, but I think we will see this constant tension that we have seen for the last year and a half, 2 years, ebb and flow, but really never recede.
We talked a bit about the Madrid conference and the peace process in the region. Is the peace process just on the shelf for the foreseeable future? Is there anyone, including a president of the United States or a president of the United States in concert with other leaders from outside the region, is there anything they could do to jumpstart the peace process again, or is that going to have to remain a back burner issue?
I wouldn't necessarily put it on the back burner, but it's going to require very careful study. If we recall, the Obama administration just dashed out of the chute almost immediately and assigned Senator Mitchell to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and sadly it foundered. There was a second try under Secretary Kerry when he became Secretary of State, and that too failed after really Herculean effort on the part of Secretary Kerry and the United States. And I think we just need to understand now that the circumstances are not very propitious for getting the two sides back together again. I think we're going to have to see some fairly significant political changes on the Palestinian side. They have very weak leadership right now. It's not well supported by the Palestinian people. And of course, we do have the bifurcation in Palestine in the sense of Gaza under Hamas, a terrorist organization according to the United States and many other countries, and the West Bank under Fatah, which right now is showing itself to be rather incompetent in dealing with the many challenges, even in the West Bank, which is decidedly better off than Gaza. And so until there is some fresh leadership willing to move forward in a constructive way with the Israelis, I'm not sure we're going to see much progress. The one thing I will say is that if we were looking for a way to get things started, to encourage and work with the Israelis to find ways to improve the economic conditions of the Palestinian people, most particularly in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, they can do that. That's not an enormous sacrifice. It shouldn't diminish at all their concerns for security or the current protections that they have. But this is a good way to set a proper foundation for that eventual time when it could be opportune to bring the two sides back to the negotiating table.
Well, what role is there for sort of clustered entities? You used to be the administrative head of the Office of the Quartet Representative, the Honorable Tony Blair in Jerusalem. Are those organizations as able to affect the course of events now as they were in a position to some years ago, or are they not as influential today?
Really great question, and I must confess that the quartet did not live up to all the hopes that all the participants had when it was created in 2002, right in the midst of the second Intifada. So that doesn't seem, though, that doesn't mean, however, that groupings of country can't come together to achieve a common goal. You mentioned Syria. That's certainly a possibility. There may be other possibilities as well. Clearly, the conflicts of the region do demand that some outside powers, but maybe some even within the region, enter into the picture and lend their expertise, their closer knowledge of the conflict at hand and the cultures that are involved in order to try to find a solution. Because this is draining, this is sapping not only the economies, but the lifeblood, the literal lifeblood of so many of these countries. The United Nations just recently reported that since the Arab Spring, economic losses totaling between 650 and 700 billion. We're losing generations here, most especially in Syria, but potentially elsewhere.
Some analysts have argued that there need to be new players. Some of the rising powers, for example, China, perhaps India, should be invited to the table to see if they could somehow contribute something constructive to the peace process. Do you see a role for them, or are there more disadvantages than advantages to bringing in countries that haven't historically been at the forefront of this effort?
Traditionally, historically, those larger countries like China and India have avoided engaging in the nuts and bolts of these conflicts, perhaps because of concerns they have at home, or perhaps because of unique interests that they may have. I don't think anyone is necessarily opposed to them stepping in if they have something to contribute, but they understand how intransigent some of these conflicts are. And they see the efforts of the United States and of other nations, the European Union, Russia, and understand that maybe there isn't a whole lot yet they can bring to the table. But I don't think anyone would necessarily exclude them if they thought they had a way to negotiate an exit out of some of these conflicts.
There are many analysts who say that the initiative for a renewed peace process has to come from the grassroots, that most of the people in the Middle East are tired of war. They would readily embrace peace if something were placed on the table that had the support of outside powers. Do you think that's true, or do you think there are still plenty of people in the region who actually enjoy the fighting and hope that their goals are going to be achieved through it?
My own view right now is that one of the compelling reasons for the tensions and the conflicts that we see is the sectarianism, and by extension, I think the tribalism. And until the people of the region can begin to grapple at every level, from the community level to the national level, with that sectarianism and that tribalism that's driving so many of these conflicts, it's going to be very difficult. Now, once there is that recognition, then there are many things that an outsider, such as the United States or the European Union or the United Nations or other countries or institutions, can do to help. But there needs to be that. I mean, even at the national level, what is driving many of the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that is this unavoidable sectarian tension between the Wahhabi Sunnis of Saudi Arabia and the Shia of Iran. And they need to come to grips with this, because it underlies all the conflicts that we're seeing in virtually every part of the Middle East, with the possible exception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
As we come to the close of our conversation today, I'd like to ask you, do you think that peace is possible long-term in the Middle East? And most of the time when I ask that question, the guest laughs and the answer is not very satisfying. But I'm thinking not in the next 5 to 10 years, but longer term, 50 years, 100 years from now. Is this possible?
Well, of course it is. It is possible. And that's why I said I like the term of the Arab awakening, because it did awaken the people of the region, most importantly, and then their governments, and then the world, to the fact that the people of the Middle East, Arabs, they wanted change. They wanted to play a role in their governments. They wanted their governments to be answerable, to be accountable to the people. They wanted democracy. They wanted greater civil rights, human rights. They wanted respect for the rule of law. They wanted these far-ranging reforms, whether it's in the economy or their education systems or the role that women play in these countries. These are very noble. And with those kinds of hopes and aspirations, I believe they'll achieve them. Now, they're going to need the institutions to build the kind of nations that they want. And they're in the process of doing that. It's going very slowly. In some places, it's actually obviously taken a step back. But they're going to need a free media. They're going to need civil society institutions. They're going to need independent judiciaries, political parties, labor unions, all these things that go in to building a foundation for democratic or even stable countries. It will take them time. And then they will need the political thought behind all of that. And that's evolving too. So I am hopeful long term. In the near term, probably need to focus on the stabilization.
Well, on that note, we'll have to end, but thank you so much for joining us today, Ambassador Grappo.
It's great to be here again, John. Thank you.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.